Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm Garratt Moore. I'm the principal and CEO of Broken Bay Institute, the Australian Institute for Theological Education, and welcome to our it's a wonderful event for making more manifest the book Dearest Sister Wendy, a surprising story of faith and of friendship. Let me begin by welcoming you from across the globe. We have people from Wales, England, USA, UK, New Zealand, Singapore, Australia, and probably a few other places as well. So it's great to have you here to be able to share together in this this dialogue which is going to take place. As I do that, let's begin with a prayer, and I'd like to lead you in a short collect-style prayer built around the life of the Trinity and its impact for us. So let us pray. Creator God, creative word, creating spirit, instill in us the humility of creatures and the wisdom of co-creators. May we act and speak and breathe as if within your dance of divine love. Open us to marvel at the wonder of your handiwork. Enable us to see your spirit within all things. Teach us to respect all that is created. Humble us to hear the crisis of the earth and the cry of the poor. Empower us to respond with all our heart and mind and spirit. In Christ and through the Spirit, we seek to be the carers within your creation, Creator God. Amen. And as we welcome here, I just will find on my screen, which disappeared, and our acknowledgement of country. For those from far shores for us, it's become an important custom for us in Australia to acknowledge the Indigenous owners and inhabitants of the land on which we dwell. And so we have an acknowledgement of country. We wish to pay our respect and acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we are on today. Here at BBI-TAITE, we sit on the land of the Garratt people. We thank them for allowing us the opportunity to meet on their lands, where Aboriginal people have taught and performed age-old ceremonies of storytelling, music, dance, and the celebration of the spiritual connection to the land. We pay our respect to all elders past, present, and future, for they hold the memories, traditions, culture, history of this land, and the hopes of Aboriginal Australia. We pay our respect to all Aboriginal people present here today. To follow our welcome, it's now time to introduce our two key dialogue people. So I'll do that, and then I shall get out of the way and leave them to chat about this wonderful book. Robert Ellsberg probably doesn't need a lot of introduction. However, Robert is the publisher and editor-in-chief of Orbis Books. He's the editor of 5 volumes of the writings of Dorothy Day, whom he knew personally, and the author of many books on saints, including All Saints, The Saints' Guide to Happiness, and A Living Gospel, Reading God's Story in Holy Lives. Robert loves dogs, plays the electric guitar, and has not visited Australia yet, except slightly by Zoom. So welcome, Robert. We're very excited to have you as able to speak to this wonderful book and to give us a few more insights in it. Working through Robert's writing and thinking and dialogue here is BBI's presentation sisters lecturer, Dr. Michelle Jones. Michelle is a specialist in the area of spirituality and has a keen interest and academic interest in the writings of Ruth Burrows. So I think that fits quite nicely here, doesn't it, Michelle? And so Michelle will take up the dialogue position and enable us to sort of work through how Robert has seen the book and the process of the book, its contents, and the journey of the book. So with that, over to you, Robert, and to Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Garratt. Robert, I echo Garratt in saying a hearty welcome and wholehearted thank you for being here. I also echo Jared in welcoming our friends in Australia and throughout the world who are with us. I just wanted to make a special mention of Robert's wife, Monica, who's joining us or will be joining us from California. I also want to mention those brave souls in the UK who are here very, very early in the morning. Hope you've got a strong cup of coffee at the ready. And I want to say a special hello to my beloved friends, the Carmelite Sisters of the Covington Carmelite Monastery in New Orleans. Hello. The Covington nuns and I have a lot in common, and one of the most important things we have in common is that we are fervent Robert Ellsberg groupies. So we're united in enthusiasm this morning. So everyone's invited to pop questions to Robert into the chat box, and hopefully we'll get to some of them as we go forward throughout this conversation. We may end up running just a tiny bit longer. If you have to go, don't fret. As you know, this conversation is being recorded and it will be automatically emailed out to you after the presentation. So Robert, congratulations on the publication of Dearest Sister Wendy, this precious, precious book. I don't have, you know this, I don't have the words to communicate the radiance and the wonder of this beautiful book. It's as everyone who reads it knows, it's utterly captivating and it's transformative at the deepest level of one's being. But what I can say is thank you to you and to Sister Wendy, who I believe with all my heart is here with us in the spirit. Thank you for this precious publication, for this treasure. Robert, you corresponded with Sister Wendy on an almost daily basis from the beginning of 2016 until her death at the end of 2018. This is remarkable in itself. Could you just give us an idea of how this period of intense correspondence emerged?
Well, thank you very much for the pleasure of being here. I wish I could be a little closer to Australia right now. And thank you, Michelle, since you were one of the first people to read the book and to confirm for me what I felt, which is that it really, as you said, has a kind of transformative message for readers. So you were the first to reserve this time for the international launch of the book in Australia, and so I'm really pleased to be here and grateful for your support and encouragement. As for how this began, it really is a kind of a mystery to me. It almost feels as if from somewhere Sister Wendy called me into her life. We had known each other remotely for 10 years or more. I published several books by her. She was a great fan of my writings on Dorothy Day. In fact, she was on a BBC program where she was asked to name 3 books that she would take to a desert island, and one of them was Dorothy Day's Diaries, which I had edited. So we were, had a kind of mutual admiration. I knew her initially from her television program, without ever imagining that we would ever become friends. But it came to pass, and that's kind of a long, not necessarily interesting story, but we got to know each other. But the point is that Sister Wendy wrote charming, inscrutable handwritten notes that were very hard to read, in fact, almost impossible to read. And at first I would get very excited to get a note from Sister Wendy. And eventually I could hardly help groaning a bit because I knew I could only read about 50% of what she wrote. But she also had made it very clear that she was not encouraging intimate relationships. She had a way of keeping people at a distance, sort of maintaining boundaries that I came to see were not only rooted in her vocation as a hermit and a contemplative, but also I think deeply rooted in her temperament. And she was could be charming and friendly, but she was very skilled at kind of keeping people outside. especially discouraging editors like me who would say, well, why don't you write more about your own personal life or your thoughts about prayer or something? And she would say, I have no interest in that. I have nothing to say. I have no ideas, whatever. So the funny thing was that I'd actually received a letter from her in which she sort of almost said, kind of goodbye. She said, I enjoy your letters, but because of my vocation as a contemplative, I really don't have space for correspondence unless it's about something really important. And so I thought, well, that's fine. I respect that's her life. That's her way. All that changed then in 2016, and in a most curious and almost providential way, which is that she sent me an Easter card. She would do that, Christmas, Easter, send cards around to her people she knew with a little message, assigned it. And she said by this time there was an American Carmelite sister who was helping her with correspondence because Sister Wendy was too old and infirm to live by herself anymore on the Carmelite monastery grounds. So she had moved into the enclosure. And this sister would come in and with a laptop, which Sister Wendy called her machine, and she could take dictation. And suddenly, of course, that made Sister Wendy magically, legible. It's like a dog talking. You could suddenly understand, what they were saying or something. And but Sister Leslie said, "We need you." This card came back because our address had changed. So it was this funny accident of a card that went astray that started all this. And it was only today that I went back and I was thinking about, it's even more mysterious than that, because the subject of her Easter card was a Bruegel painting, the theme "Noli me tangere," the words that Jesus said to Mary Magdalene at the tomb, "Don't touch me." And I thought in a funny way that motto could have been, uttered by Sister Wendy herself. Don't cling to me, don't get too close, don't try to touch me, don't try to hold me. I wondered, why did she choose that particular? I mean, it seems almost too appropriate, But the mystery of that card of "Don't touch me, don't cling to me" became this occasion of the deepest intimacy between us. I simply wrote back and said, well, here's our address. By the way, you might be interested that we're going to be publishing a book of letters of Vincent van Gogh. And so suddenly Miss Sister Wendy wrote back herself and said, I'm very interested in that. So I sent her the book and I sent her other books. And I expected she would thank me and that would be it. But no, she responded with her thoughts about the book, and I responded with how the book came about and other books we were doing. And soon we were, it just continued. I kept thinking that she would retreat back to the great silence, but she didn't. And it began to become a daily gift in the mail every morning was a letter from Sister Wendy. And they were not short little notes either. They were long and thoughtful notes, originally about subjects of our common interest, particularly, my writing about saints, about Dorothy Day, about the meaning of holiness, which was a subject that we were both deeply fascinated by. And I, of course, with my publisher's hat on, said, it'd be wonderful if you would think about writing more about your own spiritual journey and what led you to this life and your interior life and what that's like. And she said, oh, that's the last thing I would ever want to do. I have no interest in that whatsoever. Eventually she said, well, perhaps if someone asked me questions, I could answer them. So I said, well, I have lots of questions. And I began asking her all these questions. Well, how did you end up, at the Carmelite monastery? What is your daily life like? And I thought I was just sort of, warming things up. I didn't mean I was going to stay on that superficial level, but she was very off-put by the whole thing and thought it was boring and it didn't interest her. And she was discouraged about the whole thing. But I began to discover that if I shared my own story a little bit more, and I don't mean to sound as if I had this, crafty editorial, professional motive, but I was really interested to know her better. And I began, I would tell things about my own story, my own life, about where my, interest in saints came from, my work with Dorothy Day, my life in my family, my work and things. And she would begin to respond, not just to respond to what I was writing, but to share more details about her own story. And pretty soon this began to get into just go into a much deeper level, until finally, is after several months of this, she said, you know, you've often said that maybe you'd like it if I would write something more about, you know, my own personal life or journey, and perhaps you could cobble something together from these letters we've been exchanging. Well, little did I know at that point that we were going to be, you know, 2 years still more of correspondence to share. So I don't think at that point I thought, well, we've been writing a book all along without knowing it. I put that all aside, and from that point it was just an invitation to go to a much deeper level than either of us had ever imagined, and I think anything that Sister Wendy had ever you know, come close to in her life.
That's remarkable, Robert. I think if I had received that letter from Sister Wendy saying perhaps the book you've been looking for is already here in our letters, I would have started to kind of self-censor as I was writing and kind of think, oh, I'm writing for a wider, but it's so clear that that's not happening. You know, you kind of acknowledge that, and so that's a great idea. And then the letters just continue on with their beautiful, personal, very natural, authentic kind of spirit. So there's sort of a non-self-consciousness about the correspondence. Even after that.
Well, I said that, you know, before she said that, you know, correspondence, unless there's a real purpose, you know, is not interesting to me or part of my life. And evidently she began to, I think, feel there was a deeper purpose. But I don't think that was just with the thought that we were going to share this with a wider audience. But I think that she began to see, as I did, that this was a deep spiritual journey that we were on together. And that we were both exploring, you know, new worlds. Me by penetrating and going into the heart of the life of a contemplative hermit, and her, you know, in an opposite way, you know, kind of being drawn into the wider world that I'm engaged in. But also, I think, holding up a mirror to one another, in which we really reflected deeply on the story that God was telling in our own journey, in our own lives, and a subject that had never interested Sister Wendy before. She was so conscious of being focused entirely on the presence of God, and on where she was, you know, right now, in the face of God, face to face with God, or enveloped by God in this life of prayer, that she'd never had any sense that there was any purpose to look back. She said, I understand that some people feel that self-examination is a, you know, is part of the spiritual life. She'd never felt that herself. And as I began to share with her, you know, in a vulnerable kind of way, you know, my own story and the things that had shaped me, and the realization that those were not all just happy things or wonderful opportunities to encounter a saint like Dorothy Day, for instance, but also, you know, setbacks and failures and heartbreaks and things that were hard in my life. And she seemed to really identify with that and respond to that, and to realize in her own peculiar life, it was peculiar. She, at the age, you know, from an early childhood, she knew she wanted to be a nun and wanted to spend her life, you know, in prayer, but she didn't really know that there were different kinds of nuns. And she entered a teaching order when she was 16, and then found herself, you know, bound to this life of teaching children and high school students, and something that was very uncongenial for somebody who was, by nature, you know, had felt like so odd in many kind of social situations. She but so, you know, it never occurred to her that she had any choice in the matter. She had chosen this life. She had made a vow of obedience, and that was where God meant her to be. And yet, by this circuitous route, you know, partly because she had a kind of nervous breakdown or a physical breakdown, and her order finally allowed her to dispense from her vows and become a consecrated virgin and hermit in 1970, living on the grounds of this Carmelite monastery, and finding herself by this mysterious route exactly in the life that was most congenial for her. She couldn't imagine a happier life. She said, I'm sure that if I'd started from the beginning, I would have gladly become a Carmelite, you know, now that she knew the difference. But she said, if I was a Carmelite, I wouldn't have nearly the solitude and the opportunity for silent prayer that I have now as a hermit. So it was, both of us were aware of the way that that setbacks, failures, heartbreak, suffering had been part of the journey that had led us to where we are today and where we were going.
Mm. Yeah, there's so much I want to say. Just in that, the co-sharing of your journeys, it's such a privilege for the reader to witness this connection between the two of you. I think that was one of the first things that leapt off the page to me, just this profound heart-to-heart connection, you know. And in one of your letters, Robert, you say it's not so much having something to say, but having someone to say it to, you know, like this experience of being known by each other. And in that mutual knowing, this co-creation that emerged, you know, we see that the fullness of the two of you emerging before our eyes as you kind of chip each other away. It's like you're a block of marble before each other, and we see you chipping the true self of each other out, you know. Was that a surprise to you to find yourself kind of emerging more and more, and for Sister Wendy to find herself emerging? Or could you just sort of speak to that profound mutuality and to that co-creation that emerges as the text unfolds?
Well, I mentioned before, you know, and I only noticed this really as I was editing the book and going back on it, as Sister Wendy began to reflect more on herself. I mean, I think she'd always thought, well, being a contemplative, being a hermit is sort of the best thing anybody could possibly be, and not realizing that, you know, maybe that wouldn't be so fun for everybody. But she has said, you know, from her childhood, she had a sense of being strange and different from other people and odd in different situations. She didn't really have friends. Her family didn't really understand her. And she thought, well, when I become a nun, I'll be surrounded by people who know exactly what I'm experiencing. And I think it was almost like realizing that she had a kind of a gift, like perfect pitch or something, and realizing that not everybody shares that. And she said that I had at an early age, you know, when I was in the convent, I think she felt embarrassed or shamed sometimes in trying to explain what she took for granted about her relationship with God and prayer, and realizing that other people didn't understand that. And so she gradually adopted this, you know, attitude of just not sharing any of that with anybody. And so a certain amount of that, of course, her spirituality comes through in her writings. Anybody who's read some of her reflections on art, but it never talks about herself at all. And I think that it was a completely new experience for her of the you know, feeling the trust, I think, of someone who would listen to this in a non-judgmental way, and not for some ulterior, you know, purpose or whatever, but just in listening and empathy and companionship that really became, you know, deep relationship of love. You know, there were a lot of things also that I had not been able to share with other people. Here I'm sharing them in a book, some of them, but it was because of Sister Wendy's just open heart and invitation to be vulnerable, to feel safe in that relationship, that we both began to find ourselves in this kind of dance, and constantly, I think, surprised by where it took us.
Yes. Yeah. You use the phrase non-judgmental there, and at one stage, Sister Wendy talks about your writings on the saints, your extensive writings on the saints, and I think she speaks of your non-judgmental love and interest in the saints, and I think she felt herself looked upon by you with the same kind of gaze, you know, this non-judgmental love and interest, and that's what helped kind of her feel free.
She did say exactly, quoting that, she said that I think that's what makes me feel comfortable or trusting in sharing these things with you. And of course, you know, studying out, I think on one hand, I think she's probably very glad not to be here when the book comes out and have exposed herself, you know, so much. But in some ways, I think it was an invitation or an opportunity for her to to step out. I mean, when she did her art programs, you could say that that was quite a departure from the life of a hermit, but she was able to kind of justify it in a way, because I think she felt so much that it was a kind of prayer for her. It wasn't being social and gadding about. It was a kind of way through art to draw people to the deeper dimension of source of beauty that lies behind art. So she felt it was a kind of an apostolate. She was happy when it was over, and to go back to that. But I think in the same way, she may have begun to feel that this was also an apostolate, and that she did have a treasure of some kind that she had never discussed or described. And if she could entrust that to another person that she trusted to share it on her behalf, that maybe that was the higher purpose. I mean,
Yes.
I scarcely think she would have consciously thought that, because she it was not just humility. She really felt that she said, I have no ideas. I'm a very uninteresting person. Nothing about me is interesting. All I do is respond to things. I respond to art or whatever. If you ask me a question, I'll respond to it. But I have no thoughts of my own. And I don't know if that was, I don't think that was just humility. I think that she didn't really credit exactly, the value or the importance of what she'd experienced and learned, and what that might mean for other people.
Yes, she's certainly not faking it, I think, when she says that. And on the other hand, she's so wrong, like page after page is just crackling with insights from both of you, I just want to quickly mention that there's someone here, Will, who happened to stumble upon Sister Wendy as she was recording one of her art programs back in the 90s. So that was quite an experience for him. But I do want to go on, Robert, to talk about some of the universal themes that emerge from your personal correspondence, and one of them is the theme of holiness. You and Sister Wendy dance around that theme all throughout the book. Could you tell us something about this theme that emerges from that you create together, this understanding of holiness?
Well, Sister Wendy, one of the things that interested her about me was that I've written many books about saints. I wrote a book called The Saint's Guide to Happiness, in which which totally encapsulated a lot of her spirituality, this idea that we have, there's a way to God in all the different aspects of our lives, not just in the sort of spiritual aspects, but in work and love and relationships and in community, in stillness, in suffering, especially in the chapters on suffering and death. And that there's a relation between our true happiness and the call to holiness. And she also shared with me, and this is a thing we kept first batting around together, that when we talk about saints, a lot are called to be saints, that seems implausible to people, because we think of just these exceptional people who are canonized, and we think that that's all that's important, whereas it's just a name, a kind of certification by the church, but holiness is something much wider than that, and there are many countless saints who are known only to God, but holiness also as more of a continuum. It's more of a spectrum. It's more of a journey. Pope Francis talks about a journey faith, in which we encounter God along the way, and Sister Wendy was really drawn to this idea that the importance is not being perfect or having achieved some level of kind of mastery, like it's an academic subject or something like that, or checking off all the boxes, but it's a longing and a hunger for God that draws us to go farther and deeper, throughout our lives. And that on this journey, there are many, traps and falls and temptations. There are many setbacks. And that's all part of the journey. It's not like that's when I stepped off the path or something. Doubt, suffering, questioning can all be part of the process. And so that made us very interested, not just in some of our favorite saints. I was once invited to give a talk on my 5 favorite saints. So that became a kind of fun thing between us to what would your 5 saints be? And we going back, and she had certain favorites. Well, among them would be, of course, Elizabeth of the Trinity was her favorite, but Therese of Lisieux and Dorothy Day she loved, and Julian of Norwich, of course. And I had mine, who tended to be more social justice-y kind of people like Oscar Romero or whatever, So we talk about that. But we both were also interested in characters like Thomas Merton or Henry Nouwen, whom we didn't necessarily feel were candidates for canonization, but who in the earnestness of their longing and hunger for God, their role as kind of spiritual explorers who were constantly responding to a call that was drawing them deeper into the heart of their vocation, that could be more edifying or more helpful to many people than image of this exceptional Padre Pio or something like that. I mean, it's not how do you be like Padre Pio, so that subject of holiness was one of the most interesting and fascinating topics for Sister Wendy, and it's one that I happen to share. So we went back and forth quite a lot on that. And in fact, the fruit of this, I gave a retreat at Quidnam, partly through her agency, where I got to meet her finally. But the subject then became a book that I published called The Living Gospel that was coming out just at the time when Sister Wendy died. I dedicated it to her, showed her the cover just as she was dying, one of the last things, yes. And I wrote about people like Dorothy Day, Henry Nouwen, Thomas Merton, Flannery O'Connor, the novelist, who are not necessarily candidates for canonization, but who show us how to look at the life of a holy person and not just their teachings as a kind of spiritual text. And that helps us to look at our own lives in that light. And Sister Wendy, acknowledged that very much, but she hadn't really practiced that in terms of looking backward. She recognized it in other people, and she was incredibly astute. And she said, I'm not very good at thinking about myself, but I think I'm very good at thinking about other people, especially about seeing the holiness that's in them, whether they see it or not. But I don't think she had really looked very much at the holiness, written in her own story. And that was one of the things that came through.
It sure did. I love the theme that the two of you often touch on, or interrelated thing of temperament, how holiness emerges from our particular temperament. You don't have to fit a mold, but the modes of holiness are as many as the modes of temperament. And also vulnerability as a pathway to holiness, embracing our vulnerabilities and our neediness. And at one stage she talks about her disappointingness, and she sort of she uses that word too, and says how oh well, my disappointingness is just another way for me to be united with the Lord, and so temperament and vulnerabilities and desire, as you said, Robert, as all factors in holiness.
I think one of the things that moved me a lot was I was describing a friend who said that he was very sick and ill, and he was finding it difficult to pray. And she said, we can always pray. People think that our prayer has to be amazing or fabulous or whatever, but it comes out of wherever we are if we open ourselves to God, and God welcomes us in that state. And if our state is exhausted or feeble or sick or despairing or unhappy or whatever, that our prayer comes out of that place. She said, I don't necessarily experience this myself, but I respect it in those who do, who are able to pray, even when they're in despair or sad. And there's something very precious about that. But I'm sorry, I interrupted you, but I think that there was a lot, in the book about this time. In fact, it began in the beginning. She mentioned that she had a terminal illness of hardening of her lungs that made it very difficult to breathe. Probably ultimately what carried her off. Also, she was having small heart attacks all the time, and she was falling down and breaking her arm and having all kinds of other, ailments like that. So she was living very much, in the face of the cross, with daily reminders of her approaching death, and something that she was not afraid of in the slightest. She, would be very ironic if somebody had lived a life like this, was then at the end was terrified of what was going to come next. No, she felt that it would come in God's own time, but that she was going to meet her spouse, or the beloved. But I think that it's possible that in that vulnerability physically, that also is a factor in enabling her to stop and reflect on things that she hadn't so much before, and to share those with another person.
Yes, it was incredibly providential that you encountered her in such a deep way, and that in that last chapter of her life, where she, perhaps she was especially disposed to be more vulnerable and to express that. Just a reminder, everyone, that yes, we are being recorded, and the recording will be sent out to everyone after we've finished. And please, if you have questions for Robert, pop them into the chat, and we'll do our best to get onto them. Robert, the topic of suffering, you've mentioned it a little bit there, but it's something that, again, appears a lot throughout the pages, and often it's connected with joy. And you often hear this in the saints, suffering and joy, and I must admit it's something that kind of makes me cross, and I think, oh, they can't be suffering too much if they're so joyful about it. And but somehow I was more convinced by you and Sister Wendy on this theme. Could you just expand on that a little, this theme of suffering and its connection to joy?
Well, she didn't, write a treatise on the subject or explicate this, at length. There, as you say, it's an idea that not unique to Sister Wendy, but find in so many of the particular saints that she admired. I think Sister Saint Elizabeth of the Trinity, another young Carmelite who and she felt was one of the great mystics. She would often quote her saying that suffering and joy are intertwined. You can't have one without the other. I think of Henry Nouwen, one of his last books was actually published posthumously. It was called "Can You Drink from This Cup?" And it's taken from the disciples who want to be with right hand of Jesus, whatever, in his kingdom. And he says, "Can you drink the cup that I drink from?" And Henry Nouwen takes that to mean that in this cup of Jesus, that joy and suffering are inextricably combined. You can't just take the good parts and not the painful parts. But it's that acknowledgement that even in the midst of the painful parts, we have capacity. There's an access to joy, which is not going around with just a blissful smile on your face all the time, but it's a feeling of the kind of victory of life or love over the cross, or the cross as a kind of on the road to resurrection, kind of Paschal mystery. And she write a lot about. She said, I used to just focus on the resurrection all the time, and now I realize that there's no way to the resurrection except by the cross. And Jesus, even as the resurrected one, was the crucified one. So those kind of wounds, those kind of sufferings, those pains are not an impediment or an obstacle to our ultimate happiness. But it's only on the path of holiness that you can comprehend something like that. Otherwise, it's completely meaningless or incomprehensible. And it's a grace, to be able to experience that or believe that. It doesn't necessarily come naturally. It's a mystery. It's a folly. It's a stumbling block. But it's something that she believed in very deeply and lived with very deeply.
Yeah, she certainly did. And there's so much encouragement in the book. And as you say, talking about an individual path to holiness and seeing our own lives as a journey, and seeing those wounds as not obstacles or when we fell off the path, but as deeper channels into the mystery of living the life of Jesus, or letting the life of Jesus live within us. This is sort of connected to this. Several times throughout the book, Sister Wendy says to you that her life is already heaven, or this is already heaven. I think she said that to you as her parting words at Quidnam. Could you say more about what that meant to her, Robert?
I was struck when I was writing the piece about her favorite saint, Saint Elizabeth of the Trinity, who said that heaven is being with God, and since God is in my soul, I'm in heaven all the time. And she said, when I realized that, I realized I wanted to share that news with everyone. I think that Sister Wendy had that same kind of experience or feeling that heaven is not just something after we die. It's not some other world, but it is the kind of ultimate dimension of our present life. If we only had kind of eyes to see it, and learning to see that with the eyes of the heart, is and through prayer and through attention and through just desire to be with Jesus. It puts us in the presence of heaven, that there's a continuity. I think there's tendency, there's one kind of strand, which is to think, that God, our purpose here is to love, serve, God in this life so we can be happy with him in the next, and so that the happiness of heaven is some kind of reward for being good in this life, Whereas Sister Wendy was more in the school, I think, with Dorothy Day also of seeing, that there is a continuity between our happiness in this life, happiness in the deepest sense, not just having a good time, and that ultimate destination when we, no longer see through a glass darkly, but face to face, And I think that it was a theme that she mentioned many times, in her writing. She said, well, for me, heaven is right here, and it meant that she had the discipline of her life, the function of her life as a contemplative was to enable her to see that. So it is, yes. When I met her at Quidnam, and we had this final opportunity to meet face to face, not through the glass darkly of the Sister Leslie's machine, but she just grabbed my arm and said, for me, this is heaven. And I didn't mean, she didn't mean like, boy, this is, the next best thing to being in heaven or something. This is heavenly meeting you or something like that. It was something that, it was not just describing herself. It was reminding me of something that I needed to keep in mind too. It was like, be awake. Yes. That was almost a sort of her message. Be awake to the miracle of being alive and knowing the love of God, sharing that with others. So I actually wanted to call this book. Originally, I thought it was going to be called "This Is Heaven," and some of my colleagues said, "Well, that just sounds a little too pious." And so I struggled with a lot of different titles, but always I still kept the epigraphs in the book were 3 little texts about heaven, including one of Dorothy Day's favorites from Catherine of Siena, who said, "All the way to heaven is heaven," because he said, "I am the way." And I use that as the title for the letters of Dorothy Day.
Yeah, that "This Is Heaven," it is such a crackling, at least, subtitle of the book. That's not the official subtitle, but it is a theme. It's as if the two of you could just, it's hard to describe. You kind of lift the veil on life and you enter into, what's deepest. And this is heaven, this life. And through your discussion of suffering and joy and prayer and sanctity and all of that, that's exactly what you're talking about, that we're living the life of allowing ourselves to be loved by God and letting the fullness of our true selves emerge and transforming the world through being our true selves and all of that, that is heaven, and that is what we're called to live in the here and now. We have a question here from Will, who is the very person who saw Sister Wendy filming, and he writes, "I wonder, do you have any sense of the hermit life making something new of Sister Wendy as distinct from it being the right fit for her nature?
Well, my knowledge of Sister Wendy is mostly through what she shared with me. She did say in the letters that Sister Rachel, Ruth Burroughs, who was the prioress who invited her to live there, felt that there had been a change in her over the years, and that she had become, maybe less judgmental, or that she was more accepting of other people. I don't know. I couldn't possibly say. She felt that the time of being a hermit for her was the golden time of her life, and nothing was better than when she finally moved into the cell without a window, basically, in the monastery, and could just devote herself without any distraction at all, to the life of prayer. I think it's funny. I talked about Julian of Norwich, who anchoress from the 14th century, from not too far away. Sister Wendy, one of her favorites. And I said, do you think in another age you would have liked to be an anchoress? And she said, oh, I think it would be wonderful. But she said, except that for Julian of Norwich, she would have a window onto the church, but also a window onto the street where people could come to her for spiritual advice or counsel. I wouldn't want that window on the street. So that was much too social for Sister Wendy. So, it certainly was a huge change from her previous life as a teaching nun. But I felt that I couldn't say the whole course of her time as a hermit, but I did have the feeling that in the kind of light that I brought into that cell, I brought new things into it, and it stimulated her to grow in ways that I think might not have occurred otherwise, and that were important in her own growth and the path that she was pursuing.
Very much so. You mentioned Ruth Burroughs then, Robert. I must share a little anecdote that it only just occurred to me to share it now. I was speaking to Ruth once, many years ago, about Wendy coming to live there on the grounds of the Quidnam Carmelite Monastery. And Ruth, or Sister Rachel, as she's really known, mentioned that when the proposal was first presented to her, because she was prioress at the time and had the authority to make the decisions about that, when the proposal was mentioned for Wendy to come to live there, she declined initially. Rachel said, no, it would be too distracting, not what we do. And she said she had a sleepless night, and she just felt that she would somehow be resisting what God wanted to do by not allowing Wendy to come. So the next morning she called the sisters who were on the council together with her, and they all said, yep, why not? And there it was, the green light was given to Wendy. So it nearly didn't happen, but your book covers the theme of providence, and here's another act of providence, in Rachel having that sleepless night and changing her mind. We've got a question from Carmel Bendon, who's one of your Orbis authors, Robert, who has written other books, but most recently the wonderful The Mystics Who Came to Dinner. And Carmel asks, did Wendy share anything of her view on creativity?
It's funny, I asked her at one point, have you ever dabbled in art yourself? And she said, oh my gosh, I've never created anything, not even bake a cake or a flowered dress or anything like that. I think that she, felt that it was something that she admired or appreciated so much in others. And didn't really even recognize so much in herself the creativity of what she did. As she said, all I do is respond. We had an interesting exchange about the question of whether, a bad person can be a good artist or something like that. And she was talking about Caravaggio, she said, who's a combination of good and bad, you could say. She said, but the art came out of the good side. The art is what his good side wanted. So, I'm not sure I can get more exact about that. She certainly had a lot to say about art and artists that she admired, but creativity per se, I don't recall that coming up. I think probably in other writings on art, probably she has.
Mm. Yeah, I don't recall that as a theme either, apart from what you said there. And Charles here, Father Charles Waddell asks, what would be the one thing you would want the reader to take away from Dearest Sister Wendy?
Well, I know that everything that Sister Wendy wrote or said, she felt that her object was that people would come to know Jesus more deeply, come to know God more deeply. The last thing she would want is for people to know her more deeply. I don't necessarily, share that concern. I'm happy for people to get to know Sister Wendy more deeply. And I've found that people do feel their hearts kind of burning when they read this, because I hope you don't feel just like an observer, like you're listening in on a conversation, but that it really is drawing in the reader. And the response that's meant the most to me, and I've heard a lot from people, is that it's made them think about their own life story in a different way. I've had other people who said, I've been feeling very wondering what my life was all about, or why did all these bad things happen to me? And going back, they felt a kind of reconciliation with their own past, their own mistakes, their own failures, their own sorrows, to see how that was all part of the, if you want to say, creative process of grace, in kind of shaping and pairing their lives and their souls for some higher purpose, and that it's never too late to acknowledge that, or to express gratitude for all of that. So I think that well, you said in the beginning that it's a transformative experience to read the book, and that's kind of my hope for it, that it's not just an entertaining book, although it is. Well, I think it's entertaining. It's fun to read. People say I can't put it down. I started it, I carried it around all day. I didn't want it to stop, because I think that it just really does take you into, opens a window on this kind of holy space that is, in this case, shared between two very dissimilar people, but invites the reader in to experience that also. And I think you can imagine, how would you answer some of these questions, or how do they speak to you? Or when I say to her, I had this experience, I wonder if anything like that has ever happened to you, and she responds to it, I hope the reader, also sees that as a question addressed to him or her.
Yes. Yeah. I feel very seen in what you just said there, Robert. I don't know if it's just me, or perhaps we all feel that we've fallen off the holiness wagon at some point in our lives, but there's just, and then we think, oh, well, that's it now. I'll just watch everyone else go by and get holy, and, I've done my dash. But there's just something about the book and what Sister Wendy has to say and what you say with her, that it's all part of the journey, and it's all grace, and this is all the, this is heaven, this allowing ourselves to be loved in these low points as well as the high points, and yeah, it is so hopeful and as you say, transformative. Yeah, and we're certainly not spectators, we're participants. I don't know how the two of you did that, but there's just something that you can't help but be set afire as you read the book. Robert, I hate to say this, but I think we need to call it to a close. It feels like the time's gone like that, and I could spend all day talking to you. I think that we're going to hand now over to David Hewen. Is that right, Garratt, or am I handing back to you? Oh, we're on to David. Over to you, David Hewen from Garratt Publishing.
Hi, Michelle, and thank you, Robert, as well. We're Garratt are very happy and very proud to represent Orbis Books here in Australia. And of course, Robert's book, Dear Sister Wendy, has been our book of the month this month. And We think that that's a special accolade because we work with a wide variety of publishers and our own books. And so each month we have over 100 books that we look at and select one to be the book of the month. So we think that's a little recognition of the fantastic book that Robert has produced, and Orbis continues to do so. The book is available at a special price this month. Please take advantage of that. If you are in Australia, please buy through Garratt rather than Amazon. If you can't buy through or don't want to buy through Garratt, go to your local bookstores. If you continue to support local bookstores, they'll be there when you need them moving forward. If you're outside of Australia, please also try to support those local bookstores, because if we don't, they won't be there moving forward. And also, as a participant today, I've really, really enjoyed the discussion, and I thank Michelle. If you like Michelle's work today, she's also got a fantastic book on Ruth Burrows, which was published a number of years ago by Orbis as well. And I'm sure she's about to show you this. Yep, there you go. She's got it at hand. So that's also available. So please support Robert and Michelle's work. And I thank both of them, and indeed Garratt and the team at BBI, for bringing this little event to us today. It was a joyous discussion from my perspective anyway. So thank you.
Thank you, David. And let me just bring some concluding remarks to our proceedings. I think we've witnessed the art of conversation. Sister Wendy may have had other arts in mind, but the art of conversation with a very gentle and thoughtful discussion. So, Robert, thanks for your building the insights from the book and bringing them to us in a very lovely but personal and thoughtful way. And to Michelle for, I don't think it was too hard to draw much out of him, actually. I think you had the easy job here, but for leading the conversation on and for bringing us further. It was very, very interesting to hear aspects around suffering, around being awake, and that's quite the word at the moment in different circles. And for me in particular, the already heaven notion, which I suspect is deeply misunderstood in the liturgical tradition, where it actually is quite common, but not as well understood as was unpacked today. Our thanks to David and to John Garratt. BBI works closely with John Garratt, and so we echo his words, and we're also avid readers of Orbis. So Orbis is a well-cherished press in Australia for interesting and important books. So thanks, Robert, for continuing that tradition as well. Tradition over many years for us. Let me then bring this to a close with a final thank you to Robert, final thank you to Michelle, and also with John Garratt, with David there, to Belinda for all our organising and behind the scenes work. Over to you, Belinda.
And we do encourage you to continue buying that book through Garratt. Have a lovely afternoon, and we enjoy looking forward to the next book launch that we offer through BBI. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.